This is LibertyWIRE, where journalists, experts, and the public share their firsthand accounts of what's happening in our country. Our goal is to provide a corporate-free forum for the unrestricted freedom of speech. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the podcast. Today, we are working on a second episode about the border crisis and especially about the ICE raids and what's happening to these communities around the border. Today, we have a guest who has worked along the U.S Mexico border for a few decades. His name is Pedro Rios. He serves as the director of the American Friends Service Committee's U.S Mexico border program. He oversees a program that documents abuses by law enforcement agencies and collaborates with community groups that advocate for policy change. Please welcome Pedro Rios. Pedro, thank you for joining us on the podcast.
It's my pleasure to be here. John Carlos, thank you for having me and inviting me on.
We're exploring this idea of raids along the U.S. Mexico border and certainly what the Trump administration has done to kind of ramp it up. And I know that your organization is very invested and active in this area. So I'm wondering if you could just give me a little bit of a background of your work and what your organization does.
The American Friends Service Committee is a Quaker-based organization that began in 1917 as by a group of Quakers. And their purpose at that time was to provide young people opportunities to not have to join the military and not have to go to war. And they really believed that peace with justice was a way to resolve conflicts around the world. And in San Diego, the program began in 1977, and it was in response to increased migration to the San Diego-Tijuana region and also increased attacks by groups that espouse white supremacist ideologies, particularly against Mexican migrants, but also against other migrants that were arriving to the region. And I've been fortunate to be a part of the organization since 2003. And I've been leading the U.S. Mexico border program since 2005, ensuring that how we do our work uplifts the dignity and provides mechanisms through policy that respect the human rights of migrants.
Can you tell me a little bit about what you specifically do? What is your day in and day out, especially more about what kind of threat we're under? And I'm using the word threat because I think we're all under threat here with this administration. So I'm wondering how, working with this U.S. Mexico border program, what you do on a regular basis.
Yeah, over the past year, a lot of the work that I've been doing has been both in providing assistance to recently arrived migrants, those who have not yet been processed by the Border Patrol, who are being told and were told at the time to wait between the primary and the secondary border wall. And coupled with the work that I do and that my colleagues together as a team we do in providing assistance to migrants that are already established in the United States, primarily in the San Diego region. At the border, it's been providing humanitarian aid support, such as water and food, and identifying when there might be someone that needs to be hospitalized because of the injuries that they've sustained in crossing. In those instances, we were also documenting abusive practices by the Border Patrol, and so I got to see how Border Patrol would yell and scream at people and sometimes increase their volume of Spanish, even though many of the people who were in this location did not speak any Spanish or English. And so it was quite interesting, but also discouraging to see this type of treatment. In the interior part of the country, so what is San Diego proper, providing Know Your Rights presentations to many people who are now worried about what the new enforcement regime looks like and how they could be impacted by it. And this information that I present together with my colleagues is changing all the time. And we see different measures that the Trump administration is taking that increases the possibility that people will have fewer protections under the Constitution because of how executive orders are being implemented and rolled out. And it's quite concerning because, just as you say, it's not only migrants who are undocumented, but equally those people that are documented in some status could be impacted, and even U.S. citizens, because we've seen in the past that when ICE conducts immigration raids, oftentimes they base themselves on the color of someone's skin or what they might be wearing to question, to detain them, to even arrest them, even though they are U.S. citizens. And so that's been quite a problem in the past. And I suspect that the information that we provide to migrants also is information that even U.S. citizens could use because they are based on our constitutional protections.
You described a little bit, which I may want to ask you a question about, the nature of the border itself. You were there to provide humanitarian assistance. I think that if you listen to Fox News or all some of the other right-wing media outlets, and maybe even mainstream media outlets for the most part, that this is portrayed as a war zone. Yet you're describing it as a place where people are coming for refuge. They're coming and they're fleeing violence, they're fleeing poverty, they're leaving their homelands at a place where they don't have food, they don't have money, they don't have resources. So it feels like there's a description that's going on that's not accurate. Can you just tell me what it's actually like, since that's where you work?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's correct to say that there are a lot of inaccuracies in how border communities and the borderlands are portrayed by a variety of different news outlets who don't necessarily have a pulse of what's taking place on the ground. And what I have seen over the course of the past year and a half, since September of 2023, when we set up our Solidarity Aid Station, was that in fact the number one reason in speaking to people why they left their country of origin was because of violence, and whether that was violence by state actors or non-state actors, it created a situation where people just could not live sustainably, or the impact that um, the changing climate has had in some places. So in Honduras, for instance, where there has been a drought in some places, and other places where there has been a drought, like in Guatemala, mixed in with the organized crime groups that control what can be grown out in the fields. All of that plays into why people feel compelled to have to leave everything behind. These are individuals that, if given the preference, would not want to leave their home countries, but feel compelled to do so because the alternatives are either injury or death, or being forced into participating in with groups that are involved in some sort of crime or organized crime, or having to deal with repression by state actors. And I was in touch with a family from Peru, for instance, who were middle class, probably doing better than most people who I interact with on a regular basis. And they were dealing with some real threats to their livelihoods. And so this was a family of six who would prefer not to have left Peru, but had they not, then their children were under threat because their children were being followed by what they believed was a secret police force of the Peruvian government.
You are describing what would be similar to the war in Ukraine, where over 1 million refugees fled for their safety. You're describing people who are fleeing for their safety, for their very lives. So I think that we need to take a look at the border as a place where people are not necessarily trying to invade the United States, but are fleeing places where they can no longer stay, and are fearing for their own safety. And as you say, climate change has changed the way people make a living. So that has also affected them. I wonder if you could just kind of contrast what you just said to me with the declaration of emergency that the Trump administration had created or had declared at the end of January after Trump had taken office. I have it here in front of me. I just want to read a little bit of it. And it's in high contrast to what you just said, because you're describing people in need, people without options, people who are desperate. And let me just read a couple of lines from the declaration of emergency. And this is on the White House government website. It's on what they call a fact sheet. The executive order declares this emergency on the southern border following 4 years of record-shattering illegal immigration into the United States. And it goes on to describe all of these crimes, hundreds of thousands of children being trafficked. It's allowed dangerous gangs like Venezuela gangs. It's led to the murder of innocent Americans. And it just goes on down the list so that he can, I guess, make everybody scared. I'm not quite sure what the value in that is, except it allows him to sort of open the can to all of these government this government assistance, bring the U.S. military down, ramp up ICE raids, increase the size of the National Guard. So, which version is true? I mean, the one you're telling me, or the one that the President of the United States is declaring? Because it's vastly different.
Yeah, and that's a good point. And I think the use of language that is meant to depict a war. So, for instance, using terms like invasion, using terms such as terrorist, using terms that are meant to foment fear, especially to people who are not from the border region, creates a false sense of insecurity and that our communities are consistently and constantly under threat by an unknown boogeyman, who then we can say is the extension of the bad hombre that Trump talked about during his first term. The impact then is the degradation of our basic civil liberties and constitutional protections. That's why we're seeing people that are being removed from the United States without due process rights. And in some cases, people that have that were seeking shelter and safety in the United States because of the state violence that they were experiencing in their own home country. This manufactured fear is meant to allow for the possibility of policies and measures that degrade our basic civil liberties and protections, and that's what we are seeing now, and especially over the past few days, we have seen a broad extension and application of the Alien Enemies Act, for instance, of the late 1700s, that is being misused by the Trump administration to corral a bunch of people, fly them over to another country where there's absolutely no transparency, there is a lack of protection of rights, and where these individuals are not having the opportunity to speak with their legal representatives.
You are saying to me that a declaration of emergency by the President of the United States is fabricated. I think those are your words. You said fabricated. So he is declaring an emergency that doesn't actually exist. Do I have that right?
That's correct. And if just looking at what has happened over the past, since June of 2024, the migration into the United States, irregular migration, has dropped significantly. And so this isn't a cause and effect by Trump's policies. Migration tends to go in cycles. And right now what we're seeing is a drop of migration. But the response of the Trump administration has been to fully militarize the borderlands, bringing thousands of combat troops to San Diego and to other places, as though our communities are under threat and as though we are living through war, which in fact is not the case. It's a fabrication, it's a lie, and meant to justify extremist policies that I think place at risk our basic civil liberties, not only for undocumented people or for migrants generally, but for everyone.
But that sounds like the agenda of a madman. Let's declare a state of emergency so that I can trample on your rights or bring in all of my war toys to the border, even though there's not really an emergency there. I don't understand why. I don't understand the motive behind that grand of a show. You're saying to me that the border is not a war zone, that this is not a hotbed of criminal activity, but that's not what the administration is acting on. So do you have any sense of the motive behind that?
I don't know exactly. I wish we all knew what was going through Donald Trump's mind to make decisions that aren't rooted on any sort of common sense. But I think the effect will be that many people will be hurt. We're seeing that already. We're seeing the lack of funding to shelters in Tijuana and to other places where suddenly migrants who are there are no longer able to receive the services that will ensure that their humanitarian needs will be met. Even in San Diego, there were some shelters here for migrants that were newly arrived. Their funding is being reduced as well. And suddenly what we have is a lack of infrastructure to address the humanitarian needs that people have who are fleeing legitimate crises in their home country, and who, by law, the United States should ensure that their cared for, that they're not being placed in greater harm by being sent back to other places that might be a danger to them.
You just said by law. I don't think that most people realize that we have laws on the books on how we're supposed to treat refugees and people who are seeking asylum, right? Is that what you're referring to?
That's correct. The U.S. Constitution ensures that people who are fleeing safety from harm and who are applying for asylum have the constitutional right to make an asylum claim. And this is completely being eviscerated and has been in the process of prior to even Trump 2.0. We saw this during Biden's administration. We saw it especially during Trump 1.0, and we also saw it during President Obama's administration. That the value placed on the asylum process was completely being undermined, and so that has been impacting how asylum is treated in the United States. And even though it's instilled in the U.S. Constitution, and even though the United States has signed international agreements about respecting asylum as a process and that people would have due process rights as they're seeking asylum, that is being eviscerated. It no longer stands, and most people who are seeking asylum in the U.S. just will not have the ability to do so.
You mentioned an incident in the last couple of days of people being rounded up. Can you tell me what that's about?
On Friday evening, President Trump signed an executive order. So this would have been Friday, March 14th. President Trump signed an executive order invoking the Alien Enemies Act, which would take away largely due process rights for people who are being detained and accused of being a member of a particular organization. In this case, Venezuela's known Tren de Aragua. And in that case, there were upwards of around a couple of hundred people that were placed on planes and were being sent to El Salvador to be detained in some of the more infamous prisons that President Bukele has there in El Salvador.
We're already seeing the detention of U.S. legal residents, green card holders, that are being detained for speech.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that's concerning. It's concerning because the right to free speech is under the First Amendment. It's enshrined as one of the basic constitutional protections that we should all expect to enjoy in the United States. And the affront against that should cause concern to everyone who values basic democratic principles. And in a democracy, the trampling of those rights should raise alarm. And I'm not necessarily seeing that in the general public, and it's absolutely concerning that the move is towards a slippery slope of degradation of rights and not in outrage of why that shouldn't be taking place.
I wonder if you can describe the temperature or the sentiment, the feeling in San Diego, a border city, a big border city, and a big border city south of San Diego, which is Tijuana. This is one of the most heavily crossed regions in the world where people come back and forth regularly. I mean, I think if you think of San Diego, most people in the country probably think of a tourist destination and beautiful beaches and weather and what San Diego is famous for, but they don't really understand the clash of two countries and cultures, and now this big border wall and a heavily militarized border at that. Does it creep out into the sort of tourist parts of San Diego, or is it just primarily the Latino community that is being affected?
Well, I think I would begin by answering that question by saying that San Diego has consistently been defined as one of the safest regions in the country. I think it might be number second or third on a list of the FBI, and so the idea that there's any spillover violence, the idea that San Diego as a region is under threat, or using the words of the administration, under invasion, again points to the fabrication of an imagination that isn't rooted on reality. Secondly, I would say that migration and its importance to the San Diego region, in fact, does impact and affect every single part of San Diego, and in most cases, in a good way. And so the tourist industry, for instance, in San Diego could not operate without all of the hotel service workers who primarily are migrants. All the nice parts of San Diego, usually the landscaping is done by migrants. Many people are able to go to work because their home care staff are migrants, and the list goes on and on. The agricultural fields in northern part of San Diego County, the avocado groves, the flower fields, all of these are cared for by migrants. These are individuals with whom we go to church. These are individuals that send their children to the same schools that we go to. We go to the same grocery stores. We use the same public services, the libraries, the public transportation system, and so on and so forth. And so when we hear of migration raids taking place, which have been taking place for a long time. The first raids that I saw and I documented was back in 2003 after the Department of Homeland Security was created. But now what we are seeing is that there's a much more aggressive behavior by ICE agents. They're augmented by components of the Department of Justice, Department of State, and other federal agencies. And that's one story of it. The other story is how people are resisting. They're organizing by forming community patrol groups. They are forming large neighborhood text messages where they are sharing information whenever they see something that might be out of place. They are asking for Know Your Rights presentations, which we have been conducting now on a weekly basis in different parts of the greater San Diego region. And so there is a direct response to this fear that's been fomented. But it's not only about, for many people, it's not only about completely being paralyzed. It's about how do we participate in our community, because this is our community, and we want to be sure that our home remains safe for all of us.
Do you get the sense in your own communities that people are believing the rhetoric? Because I read parts of the Declaration of Emergency that has allowed the U.S. military and militarization to happen. I think that the ICE raids are also not necessarily a response to an emergency status, but the ramping up and allowing ICE agents to go on buses and to get into schools and churches, and it's a no holds barred kind of an attack. Are there people within the community that you're describing that understand migrants and have had them as a part of their infrastructure for as long as San Diego has existed? Do people really believe that it's a safe place, or are there people that are trying to also ramp up this? I don't know. I don't feel it in San Diego. You are not talking about an emergency here.
Yeah, what's interesting is that during the course of the 2 decades that I've been with the American Friends Service Committee, we've always done Know Your Rights presentations, primarily only to migrant organizations or migrant groups and people's homes and things like that. This is the first time that the requests are being made from groups such as museums. Museums such as in Balboa Park have requested these Know Your Rights presentations. There are schools that are requesting these Know Your Rights presentations. And what that tells me is there is a much more appreciation for how migrants are a part of who we are in our community. So it could be a coworker who works at the museum whose family might be impacted by this, and there's an appreciation for what that might mean for the entire workforce at that museum. And that example could go in other ways. So there isn't an immediate acceptance of the denigrating rhetoric that's coming from the administration that we're only going after the criminals, because when people actually see who's impacted, they see, well, that was my neighbor, and I know he was a hardworking man who was trying to make ends meet for his family. That person is someone that I spoke to every single day. We said hi. There was absolutely no bad behavior that individual was displaying to me. And so people then get a sense of the rhetoric that's coming from the administration is just a pretext for wholesale raids and wholesale detention of people who are so interwoven into our communities. and
So
that's
wait a
important
minute.
to highlight.
I want to highlight that part because the administration, when they took office, really made a point of criminal aliens, as they were calling them, people who had serious criminal records, people who might have been violent offenders, people who were dangerous to society. I think in Trump 1, they had a hotline where you could call if you were a victim of a crime from an undocumented person. So they were really ramping up this idea that if you came into this country illegally, you were most likely a criminal to begin with and probably doing harm. So are you not seeing that criminal element being deported? You're telling me that it's just a general sweep and they're doing that. They're making it sound like they're going to get rid of the criminals, but it's really just a ruse to go after everybody. Is that right?
That's right. It's a ruse, it's a pretext, and unfortunately, a lot of the media has adopted that and has made that the general consensus is, well, we all want those people out of our communities. We don't want them to be roaming our streets, and so it's an unfair characterization of who, in fact, are being targeted. And when you look at some of the individuals, they some of them have active ICE claims, meaning that their cases haven't yet been resolved, but yet then they become a target. So a lot of these people are people that ICE knows that they're in the country and they have active immigration cases moving forward, but yet have not been resolved. But they become easy prey for an immigration force that it's trying to make it seem as though they are hunting down and detaining the thousands of people that they want to detain, again, who have been criminalized and who have not yet had their day in court.
Are you seeing the result of the rhetoric? Are you seeing raids? Are people's civil liberties being violated on a regular basis in the region that you govern, or the region that you take care of?
I spoke with a woman this morning, for instance, who her brother was stopped in his vehicle, and the two children were, or the three children rather, were in the vehicle. He was taking them to school, and they reached into his car to unlock the car to pull him out, and then he was subsequently detained and arrested. The family says he's never had a problem in the U.S. I spoke to a man last week in Tijuana who cares for his elderly mother who has Alzheimer's. He's been in the U.S. for nearly 20 years, and he did not want to sign the voluntary departure. He wanted to see a judge. They refused that, and he was deported to Tijuana. And so there are much more documented incidents of abusive practices where people's basic rights are not being observed or respected.
Would it be then that just the threat that we're gonna storm your church or school, just that kind of veil of fear, is that palpable? Are people running scared because they don't know where their safety is?
Yes, there are reports of parents during the first weeks of this administration that did not send their children to school. And it was during the second day, I believe, that Trump signed the order rescinding the protected locations memorandum, and so people were changing the ways they would go to work. There was a sudden drop in people conducting business. I spoke to a mechanic who said, "Yeah, I mean, we've suddenly, from one day to the next, did not have clients for a couple of weeks." And so the impact was definitely palpable. You can feel it in various communities where there's a much higher density of migrants. City Heights, for instance, in San Diego County, and other places as well.
You know, one thing that I was taught early on as a journalist, that if you can't understand why a government official is acting in a particular way, if it doesn't make sense, logical sense, because this doesn't make sense, right? We're going after criminal aliens, but there aren't any. So we're going to round everybody else up, or we're creating this atmosphere of lies and fear. So the only thing that I can understand as to why this is happening, I was taught, is to look for the financial reasons. Is part of this to fill beds in detention facilities? Is part of this to I don't know if that's a part of it. I've certainly reported on it, but are you seeing that this is a way to just make money?
I think so. I think that there is a profit motive for a lot of this. There's a profit motive for why we would want to see, or the United States would want to see, an increase in people being detained in ways that seem absurd. There have been a couple of cases here in San Diego of a couple of German nationals that were detained, one of whom was detained beyond her scheduled flight and held in solitary confinement for about 7 or 8 days. And even though she had a date and time for when she was going to leave the United States, she was held way beyond that and transferred from one location to another. Meanwhile, in private detention, and that private entity was likely making thousands of dollars off of detaining her and generating this human suffering. And I would say that even though these cases are being highlighted now, this has been going on for a long time. And that's why many organizations, including ours, have been seeking the shutting down of these private detention centers that are profiting really off of human suffering. That's what they make money off of.
You have a pretty big one in Otay Mesa, right?
Otay Mesa Detention Center easily can hold upwards of 1,300 people, and in recent years, they were wanting to expand that number.
Can you describe a little bit of what a detention facility is like? First of all, I think it's important to understand that the people who are held in detention, for the most part, have not committed a serious crime or a violent crime. These are administrative offenses. They may have crossed the border without documentation, but they're being held as prisoners in a prison setting. It's not anything but a prison setting. Do I have that right?
That's correct. These are individuals who they have civil violations because of immigration issues that they've had. Some are individuals that are in the process of seeking asylum, so they are warehoused in these prison-like settings. And so when we talk about the Otay Mesa detention facility really is euphemistic for a prison-like conditions. People wear different type of suits. The conditions are horrendous. People have complained of unsanitary conditions, especially during the pandemic. The food can be atrocious. The lack of the ability to be allowed to have sunlight. The overcrowding, lack of proper medical attention. These are all serious allegations and confirmed cases that even groups like the ACLU has sued the Otay Mesa detention facility and Core Civic, which runs it, for its improper handling and providing proper care to people living under those conditions, and again, prison-like settings.
It would be important to add here that the United States is the largest jailer of immigrants in the world. We jail more immigrants than any other place. We also are the highest profit takers for jailing immigrants. We make more money off of the jailing of immigrants than any other place in the world. So it bears to say that some of this is a scam, right? These people are not necessarily violent offenders that are going to invade this country and take whatever you think you should possess. These are people, for the most part, who contribute or who are adding value. Can you just describe to me the broken part of the immigration system? I find it odd that we invite these people tacitly. We look the other way when they come so that they can work in our fields and pay them low wages and treat them poorly. We have a large workforce in the United States that is undocumented and kind of by invitation. Yet when we want to turn down the screws, we blame them for coming. So I find that to be not necessarily disingenuous, but highly hypocritical.
Yeah, and I think you've described it correctly, John. I think that, and what I would say is that even though we talk about it as being broken, my perspective, if jaded, maybe it is jaded, is that that's how it is intended to work. So the largest major immigration reform policy that we had, where there were roughly around 3 million people that were able to adjust their status under IRCA when President Reagan signed it in 1986, which became known as the amnesty law. And that the trade-off there was to begin seeking ways of militarizing border communities even more. But yet, though we haven't had any major reform since then, and the closest that we've had was days before the September 11th, the attack on September 11th on the U.S. Days before, there was a possibility of moving towards a large immigration reform. But since then, I would say we have had reform, but it's reforming towards increasing the militarization of border communities, increasing the ways in which migrants are criminalized. And that's all that we've had since 86. It's been one policy after another, one initiative after another that seeks to tighten the screws around migration and creates a situation in which migrants can't fully thrive in the United States when they are constantly facing the scenarios of being caught in detention and being expelled from the country when people don't necessarily have their rights recognized in the way that one would expect should be in the United States.
There's an understanding, and I think the administration would probably admit that cruelty is the motive here. Cruelty is the point. If I treat you so poorly by making it difficult for you to cross, or if I threaten you with deportation or arresting you, throwing you in a detention facility, and if I make the detention facility an awful place to be, you're not going to come back. And you're going to take that message to your family and to your friends in your home country and tell them not to come because the United States is not a welcoming place. Does it work? Does it work to be cruel? Are they being effective? Are they making the United States safer or better?
It does not, and it's tied into the strategy of deterrence, right? So deterrence, where Jeff Sessions arrived here in San Diego and announced the zero tolerance policy that led to the separation of thousands of children from their parents. Over 1,000 are still separated, and deterrence, the creation of the border wall infrastructure, increasing the height of the wall to 30 feet, knowing that based on Border Patrol's own psychological field tests that people generally would become disoriented between 18 to 22 feet. And so 30 feet would be overkill. And the expectation that people falling and injuring themselves, these life-altering injuries or dying, that itself would be the cruel practice of deterring people from arriving in the United States. And in fact, it doesn't work. What are the conditions that motivate people to have to leave their home countries with the expectation that the U.S. then would be a welcoming place for people fleeing harm? And it absolutely doesn't work. And what it does is that it makes the U.S. Much less safe when its reliance is only upon a militaristic approach to people that are seeking humanitarian support. And we also see this in how the U.S. uses a certain type of narrative that is meant to influence the population against migrants that are seeking safety from harm.
Do you think that's the way that they get away with it? I mean, we are describing a system that you have worked in for decades, and you see it not working. You see there's no need for a declaration of emergency. You see there's no need to rough people up or to jail tens of thousands of people. You get it, but the way that they get away with it is by dehumanization, right? Migrants are not people. Migrants are not human beings. That's the way that they can treat them this way. Is that it's not even a question. I guess it's more of a moral thing. Like, what happened to us? Why do we get away with treating people like this now? Or maybe we always have.
Yeah, I mean, I think as a colleague of mine says, we hear a lot about the border crisis and the use of crisis to depict something that's taking place along the U.S. borderlands. And in fact, that's not the crisis. The crisis, as a colleague of mine says, is the moral crisis that we are experiencing. The inability for the U.S. government and many of its allies and many other governments as well to respond with compassionate humanitarian care for people that are seeking to live with dignity. And the lack of respect, and now the complete evisceration of what we would have wanted to see post-World War II, is that no one would be ever turned away. And that's why asylum was made, and now asylum no longer really exists. We are on extremely dangerous terrain moving forward. because as the U.S. goes on how it treats the most vulnerable, I think other countries will follow suit.
I think you're right. If you were to have watched a Trump rally, and unfortunately I had attended a couple of them in his first administration, when he was running first time for office, when he would start to talk about the border wall, there were chants, there were cheers, people would roar, then applaud. I mean, there is a real understanding in this country that the migration problem that we have at the border, if that's what you want to call it, is why the United States is suffering. I mean, people have now scapegoated immigrants enough to criminalize them and to keep them from coming, because if we can, we're going to change the face of America. We're going to heal our problems. I've not seen it like this. So, what do you see in the near future? I'm afraid it's going to get worse.
Yeah, I think things are going to become much more bleak in terms of even the possibility that organizations such as ours might be targeted because we are, what I've heard is aiding and abetting someone with committing a crime. I've been yelled at with those words by people that are would then follow us on the border or would want to expose something that's actually not happening. And I think things are going to get much worse. And I think that's why now is a moment for us to be much more committed to our principles, be much more committed to fighting for the protection of everyone's basic human rights. We can't stray from that, because if we do, then it'll become much easier for the powers that be to strip those rights away from us, and the little of what we might have as a democracy will no longer exist.
We're that far down.
I believe so, unfortunately.
You've been doing this for a long time. Is it worse than it's been, or is it kind of the same, just with a different leader?
It's much worse now. It's extremely much worse, and I believe that there are some actions that the government is taking to test the response and to force the constitutional crisis. And the bet is that if this goes to the courts, if the Supreme Court looks at some of these policies and initiatives, that it will side with the current administration, and at that point, uh, no holds barred will be the practice around immigration issues and around enforcement, and likely around our civil liberties as well.
How do you then do what you do and convince people that these are human beings, that what we're doing is degrading our very own humanity by how we're treating our neighbors and our fellow human beings? How do you get that message out when you turn on this rhetoric that is scaring us? I mean, I think it's easier to scare someone than it is to tell them the truth. I guess I'm asking you for the moral answer, if you have one.
Yeah, I mean, it's about sharing the stories of people that have been directly affected, and providing the political space for those people to speak on their own behalf. And so they can share their stories, they can tell their truth about what they experience. And my hope is that elected officials will come around. They have to come around. Some of them will, some of them won't. And my hope is that those that will have the common sense to say, this is not how we should be striving to live. People should thrive. Everyone should thrive, and not have fear be the overarching ideology for how we reconstruct our society.
Do you even have hope that that's going to happen? Because if you're saying that it's worse than it's ever been, and we're in some kind of a constitutional crisis, do you have hope that it's going to turn around?
I do find hope with the communities with whom I've been in touch. It's been impressive to see, and I don't like using the word resilience. It's more about how people are able to uh, continue to drive from their own internal power and say, this is not how we want to live, and the community connections that are taking place, the organizing that's taking place. That's where there's genuine hope for me, and sources of looking at the possibilities for something better.
I kind of want to finish the last bit of time that we have on this idea of why we're doing this. I know I can't read Trump's mind. I'm not going to ask you to read Trump's mind as to why the rhetoric is so sharp. But what happens to the rest of the world or places that are in crisis? So what if we seal the border? So what if we don't allow asylum seekers? So what if we deport the people who don't have proper documentation? Shouldn't they take care of their own? Shouldn't their governments handle their own populations? Why keep sending them? What happens if we really, according to Trump, the way he wants to solve it, what happens if he actually does succeed?
Well, I'm of the belief that we shouldn't define our relationships with other human beings based on artificial um, designations of nation states. I think that in my own case, for instance, I have family in Mexico. And so shutting down the border, and does that mean that I no longer have a relationship with them? I should no longer care about their well-being. And I think that's a question about what makes us human. Definitions based on nation states, I believe, to some extent, are archaic and aren't a real representation of how we ensure proper care for everyone. And I think that what we should strive for as countries, as nation states, is uplifting everyone's dignity, being able to value the diversity within humanity that ensures everyone is able to live successfully, able to live in a way that they are not needing to flee their home countries, and not. I also wouldn't want to disregard the U.S.'s role in destabilizing other countries that has led to people needing to flee those countries. The responsibility we have for ensuring that our environment is cared for, so that we're not living through the ill effects of climate change. These are all global questions, and so our response can't be nationalistic. It has to be broader and much more open than needing to seal our borders because we have to be protective. That no longer makes sense in our current world order.
It's not a message that the administration is receiving, for sure. So
Absolutely not. Yeah.
let's say then that Trump does fortify the physical border itself with more border patrol or infrastructure. Let's say that he does deport millions or incarcerate tens of thousands. What does he solve?
I think it's a constellation of power. What we're looking is the development of a much more of a state that's built around its own oligarchy, its own power of billionaires, that they're able to dictate the world, that ensures their current profit making mechanisms, and where the rest of us are outside of that paradigm for participating in a democracy that really values everyone's opinions.
You're saying let them eat cake.
Let them eat cake. Let them drive Teslas, and we can't accept that.
But they're turning their backs on the poor, on the desperate. Are you under the impression that people will stop coming if it's so horrible to come here and so difficult to come here? Will the desperation south of the border or in other countries lessen?
No, I think the desperation will remain. The reasons why people have a need to flee their countries will continue to be there. Now, whether people will see the United States as a safe place for them is another question. Where will people go? Will this lead to greater suffering in other countries? There are a lot of, I think, questions that are yet to be answered based on the current posture that the United States is taking.
You think people will continue to come and find other ways?
I think we are seeing some of that already. The increased maritime crossings, people getting on panga boats and trying to enter the U.S. that way. The what appears to be increased number of people crossing through remote areas, the Otay Mountain Wilderness and other areas, I think is also an indication of people saying, well, we no longer can turn ourselves in, but we still have a need to get to somewhere where it might be safer for us. And there might be other answers to that question.
Desperate people will do desperate things.
That's correct.
You don't have a solution to what the Trump administration is doing, but I do get your sentiment that we need to turn to a more humane approach to the way that we manage our border. I don't see it happening. So at least in this instance, and I don't see that the Trump administration, with its long arms reaching into the countries that are sending desperate people. There's no effort. I mean, USAID money has just been pulled. You know, so if anything, there might be exacerbating the problem.
Yeah. Yeah.
What do you see in that kind of what do you see in that kind of a world? If there are people going hungry or people trying to flee increasing violence, and we've created a moat around our country, I don't know what kind of a world that looks like to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think we certainly can't rely on Trump or his administration to make the right decisions here and to be the North Star for us. I think when I've been asked, well, if you had a few words to say to Trump, what would it be? I wouldn't say anything. I think here right now is how do we recover or resuscitate the balance of power? Congress has a lot of power still. And even though they're being kind of the Democratic Party is not necessarily presenting itself as a contending power to the current regime, Congress still can push back hard enough. That's really where some of the power is within government. Outside of that is how do we build community power so that the protections that we seek for people who are in a much more vulnerable situation receive those protections locally, at least find some dignity within the United States.
My last question to you, it's deeply philosophical, but I think it's what's missing from the conversation when we talk about migration. I have the sense that we are missing a valuable asset. Obviously, it's not obvious right now because everybody who has the title of migrant or immigrant attached to them is criminalized or dehumanized. But there is also a spirit that built this country based on migration, based on people coming from all over the world who were fleeing some kind of persecution. So, I mean, even the poem on the Statue of Liberty is an invitation to those kinds of people who can't make a living or can't stay in their home countries, is to come here. And we're overlooking what an immigrant spirit or what a migrant contributes to this population. Can you just maybe inform me and others of what you've seen in the people that you know and the people that you live amongst, what qualities they bring to us?
Certainly, most people that are coming to this country and who are labeled as immigrants or migrants are people that want to make work to sustain their families, whether it's here in the United States or back in their country of origin. People are enrich the United States by their own cultural backgrounds and their own cultural experiences. There are a variety of lived experiences, I think, to which the U.S. benefits from when we are interacting with people that are from different parts of the world. There's a lot there to that question. I don't think I fully answered it to its extent that it can. I think what I can say is that my experience in living with migrant communities and even in my own family, people are hard workers. There are hardworking families that are now being scapegoated for the problems of society that I think has been a never-ending story, and we need to break those cycles, especially under a much harder and hardened regime that seeks to criminalize those hardworking people.
Yeah, I think you touched on so many points. For me, it's more about us, the oppressed, which the United States was born out of oppression. A colonized country is now becoming the oppressor. We don't see that journey. We don't see that we're greedy at the expense of individuals. The thing that I always glean from someone who comes to this country seeking a better life is they know the value of freedom. They're fleeing because they no longer want to live in those conditions. That spirit that's not going to settle for a failed government, or for a criminalized government, or a place where they can no longer make a living. They know what freedom is about because they're leaving oppression. So I think that if we don't allow that spirit in, I think we're probably walling ourselves off from the very thing that created this country in the first place. Maybe that's too out there.
Maybe not. I think that's just as appropriate an answer, especially when we consider that freedom is really the foundation for which people usually say they want to arrive at the United States, and it's emblazoned in most emblems of patriotism within the United States.
Yeah, what I'm witnessing now and what you're sharing with me now feels like the reverse of freedom. Feels like the antithesis of freedom: oppressing people, jailing people, deporting people, creating false premises about their violent natures. Whatever it is, that doesn't feel inviting or free to me at all. So, Pedro, if anything is happening in your community, please keep in touch and please let us know. I thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, John Carlos. We'll definitely be in touch, and let's see where we are in a few months.
Okay, thank you. For more information about our podcast and links to the shows, you can listen to us on LibertyWIRE.org or Facebook at LibertyWIRE and YouTube at Liberty-Wire, or wherever you get your podcasts.